The heavens are telling of the glory of God. Look up and seek His wisdom from above.
In the previous video, we learned the first rule for understanding sentences and saw its importance. That rule demands that we look for the proper antecedent to identify pronouns. Now let's pull in a few more rules. Number 2, a sentence should be understood as the author intended the original recipients to understand it. Does the author specify an intention? As we learn to respect a speaker's intention with regard to words, we also have to respect his intention with regard to sentences. Luke offered observations on several of Jesus' parables before he gave their details. His intention was to explain why they were spoken so we could understand Jesus' meaning. How are we intended to understand the parable of the unjust judge, beginning in Luke chapter 18 and verse 2? Well, Luke tells us the intention of Jesus in verse 1. In Acts, Luke tells us about the riot in Ephesus, with Paul and Silas being charged with teaching unlawful customs. And that's in Acts chapter 16, verses 20 and 21. However, we are to understand that the charge was inflated in anger. You can see that in verses 37 through 40. Does the context point to any peculiarities in the wording or actions being studied? As we see there in Acts 16, this really helps us. Now, Paul told the Colossians to let their speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, Colossians 4 and verse 6. This verse speaks of dealing with outsiders and opportunity. Prior to that, Paul refers to God opening doors for preaching the truth. Paul wants his hearers to use the best possible approach for making the most of teaching opportunities. Is there a parallel passage that will help explain the meaning? The Gospels are filled with them. And if the parallel statements are worded a little bit differently, rather than see them as contradictions, we can really get a wonderful window opened to the meaning. Luke has Jesus saying, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents?" Luke 12 and verse 6. Matthew, on the other hand, presents Jesus pricing 2 sparrows for 1 cent, Matthew 10:29. Their insignificant value is emphasized. If you bought 4, you got 1 free. Now, rule 3 is that sentences that pertain to divine law will not create absurdities or command anyone to do evil. Jesus commanded the amputation of one's hand if it causes stumbling, Matthew 5:30. But common sense tells us that self-mutilation is wrong and would make Jesus' view of righteousness absurd. The point presented is in the terrible consequence of sin. You might want to think of it as teaching by degrees. If hell is such a torturous experience, then it would be an insignificant loss to cut off one's hand to escape its agony. He's not saying that amputation is one way of escaping hell. He is saying that the sacrifice should be worth avoiding the consequence. Jesus is illustrated by using something undesirable to press his point on being righteous, and the reader should understand that no sacrifice is too great in his service. Elijah told the priests of Baal to cry out to their God in 1 Kings 18:27. But Elijah wasn't giving them permission or saying that it was reasonable. He was mocking them, making fun of the fact that Baal had not yet answered their calls. Rule number 4 is that just as words can only have one meaning at a time, so also sentences will have one meaning. If sentences could have more than one meaning at a time, then Scripture would become a hopeless riddle without any certain message that we could pin our hopes on. When Jesus says that one must believe and be baptized to be saved, Mark 16:16, he can't mean that one must believe to be saved and be baptized because salvation's already present. When we determine what is required to be saved, we have to apply the sentence consistently. And if it appears to contradict another passage like Ephesians 2 or James 2, then we can't throw out the one we don't like. We have to study all passages to reconcile the difference. We cannot understand the Bible if we're picking and choosing portions to disregard. After all, how can we be sure we're throwing out what doesn't matter? Perhaps we're keeping what we've misinterpreted.